How's that look? Can you see it?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. All right. The longest letter by Paul, and that's why it's first in the New Testament. So what that means is when they shaped the canon of the New Testament, they ordered the letters of Paul and the letters attributed to Paul in order of longest to shortest. And that's how they all go. And then after that, they break it up with all the other letters, like the letters to Peter, to John, Jude, James, etc., Hebrews. But all the Paul ones are in order, and that includes some of the disputed Paul letters. So there are actually 7 letters that scholars are universally in agreement on that Paul wrote. And I got tested on this several times in seminary. Let's see if I can do it off the top of my head. Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philemon, Philippians, which we heard on Sunday, and that leaves 1 Thessalonians, the first letter to the Thessalonians. First letter to the Thessalonians is the first one, the earliest written work by Paul, but it's kind of buried in the New Testament due to its length. Romans is the last letter written by Paul chronologically, later in his life. And there's many reasons that we'll kind of unpack as we work through it over the next few weeks as to how scholars landed on it being the last one. But as a result, it's kind of auspicious that it's first because it's probably the most influential letter of Paul on Christian theology and Christian doctrine. It has the most sophisticated, clear, linear argument for why Paul up midstream and changed everything and became an apostle to Christ, and what using Paul's extremely intelligent upbringing and his writing style, he explains, why, basically argues the case for why Christianity, why belief in Christ. And it's just hugely influential. And some of these names you may have heard of, some you may not have, but these are at least 4 of the, I should have put Karl Barth on there too, but 4 of the kind of major Christian theologians over the last 2,000 years: Augustine of Hippo, Peter Abelard in the Middle Ages, Martin Luther in the Reformation, John Calvin a little few years after. All of them point to Romans as one of their major influences for what they did. And of all of them, probably Martin Luther is the one the best, because he was responsible for kind of lighting the match that started the Reformation, the split from Catholicism. And, he would point to Romans as one of the things that he gave him his confidence to do that. Okay. And again, if you haven't been in a Bible study with me before, sorry, you're stuck with me. But you're going to get a little bit of some teaching here first, just to kind of orient you into what we're looking at first, and then we're going to read the whole book together over the next several weeks, and we'll just kind of go chapter at a time. So now we're going to do the authorship and the dating. We think this was written somewhere in the winter of, so the turnover from the year 57 to 58, somewhere between probably what we would now call November to February, from Corinth. And I am guilty of saying I think I made some errors talking about Paul during Acts, because I just had not looked at these details in a long time and kind of got some things confused in my head. So this is the straight truth this time, I promise. I did my research. So he wrote from Corinth, which is in Greece, which is what the letters to the Corinthians are. And he was writing to God's beloved in Rome. And this is actually important. He had not been to Rome yet at the time he wrote this letter. Now, we know that Paul was martyred in Rome, or at least we believe he was martyred in Rome, although the best guesses are that's what happened. But that didn't happen for probably the better part of another 10 years. So at this point, he's writing to the people in Rome, anticipating going there eventually to start some churches. And there is some scholarly dispute talking about authorship. There always is, but there's especially here in Romans, the final chapter, chapter 16. There's some dispute about whether that was actually written by Paul, at least as part of the letter to the Romans. Maybe it was tacked on later. That's actually happens a lot in the New Testament. In Paul's letters to the Corinthians, scholars think there were actually three, but that letters 2 and 3 got smushed together to make the second letter to the Corinthians. So sometimes, in antiquity, if they were trying to, form a canon, New Testament, and they thought some of these letters had the same kind of themes, they just did a few cut and paste error, not error, but a cut and paste job to kind of splice some things together. And that happens. But, people who make their life's work to study the actual original Greek and the earliest manuscripts known to us spend a lot of time trying to debate whether, when, where, and how Paul wrote it, and what is authentically Paul and what's not. Okay. Let me just take a pause there. Those at home, I can't see all of you just yet, and just want to see if you've got any questions. Anyone?
Not yet.
Anyone? Not yet. Okay.
So Paul, was he against Christians but for 20 years before he was converted?
No, it was a lot quicker. So let's say Jesus died around 33 AD, tradition says. Paul's conversion happened within the next few years.
But he didn't start writing until
No,
he
he started writing, the writings that we have, that's the difference. The writings that we have begin around the late 40s.
Oh.
It's possible he wrote letters before. It's probably very likely he did, and they're just lost to history. He spent a lot of that time doing the things that we talk about in Acts, or that we read about in Acts, and then he starts setting up churches. And then the letters tend to be, almost all of them tend to be to churches he's already set up.
Okay.
Except for Romans, he's writing to Rome in anticipation of coming there. So he's kind of pleading his case ahead of time. Yeah, but it's a good question. It's hard to figure out because Paul is basically on the scene. Obviously he's alive during Jesus's time, but we don't have any evidence that they interacted together. But he's there for the stoning of Stephen, and he corroborates that, and Acts corroborates that. And that happened within a short time after Jesus's death, and then his conversion. But then after that, that's the better part of 30 years Paul is around. So he was a major figure. And they all knew Paul and contended with Paul. So, okay.
Greg,
Yes.
Greg, I have a question.
Go ahead.
So he didn't write any letters once he was in Rome?
I don't know the answer to that. It's possible he did, and we don't have them. But the last one, the last chronological letter we have is this letter to the Romans. I think that the idea is that he went to Rome next, if I'm not mistaken.
And is that where he was imprisoned in Rome?
Then he was in prison in Rome when he got
The
there.
whole
Or the
time?
second trip back. Yeah, remember he was kind of extradited, in other
Yes.
words, from
Okay.
Jerusalem to Rome.
But his life ended what we assume?
In Rome, exactly.
And in prison?
And in prison, yeah. In fact, I think, David, you were saying, maybe it was Sunday, you had looked it up, that the tradition says Paul was executed by Nero, the emperor of Rome.
I think, Greg, that was me. And he
Well,
was
thank you, Susan.
right. And what I saw was that he was beheaded, which was the kindest form of execution because apparently there was some friendship with Nero.
Right. Yes, thank you, Susan. Remember how towards the end of Acts, we had King Agrippa and Festus. They were interested in Paul. They kind of almost like how Herod was interested in John the Baptist, right? So instead of crucifying them, which is the worst way to kill someone, they beheaded him, which was the swiftest way to kill someone, right? So that's a good find. Good find, Susan. Okay, so again, I know it's confusing, but there's many trips. I probably should have drawn up a timeline here, but maybe I'll bring that next time. The Paul, a trip to Rome and then back to Jerusalem, and then was arrested by, there and stood trial with Agrippa and Festus, and then was kind of extradited by boat back to Rome. And then that's where he died. Okay, good stuff.
Can I just ask one?
Yeah.
And so is someone, and I don't remember who it was, had really, because they worked with leather, that he was really arthritic. Is that
That's Karen Armstrong, the author of a book called Paul the Apostle.
So that's this Paul.
This same Paul, yes. No, you're exactly right. No, this is good. Yeah, no, good to clear it up. Paul, when he, what Barb's getting at is the writer Karen Armstrong, it's a really great book. I think it's called Paul the Apostle or the Apostle Paul, one of those two. And it's recent and it's short, also good. And she talks about the likelihood that Paul didn't physically write any of these letters because his hands were arthritic from, or just all kind of like almost like crippled from the handiwork he had been doing. So, he once was a Pharisee, probably barely used his hands except for writing. And then when he was moving town to town, he was essentially homeless and he would stay with benefactors, mostly women, wealthy women or widows. So, 3 years in Ephesus, multiple trips to Corinth, all those times he's sleeping on someone's couch. Well, metaphorically speaking, he's probably sleeping in a nice guest bedroom, but he's earning his keep and he's making his money by building tents. And so he's working with hides and leather and stuff. So that's how he ends up being physically unable to write. And if those are remembered when we did Galatians, that has a really kind of hilarious point in Galatians, which I love to bring up, where it appears Paul takes the pen out or the quill out of the writer's hand and says, I, Paul, write this with my own letters. Look how big my letters are. And as if to say, I mean this part so much that I'm writing it myself, and it's really difficult for me to write. It's almost like he's grabbing a pen, kind of like this. Yeah. Okay. Good question. So I've got some various authors here that have kind of given me some of this background info. This is Judy Fentress-Williams, who's been our guest before, and she did an overview of some of the themes that you'll find in Romans. So these are things that we'll be revisiting. A couple of the most important ones. Why the Romans epistle is so important is that this is an argument for the gospel, which means good news, not necessarily the gospels because they hadn't been written yet. Okay, remember Paul's writings come first. He is talking for the very first time about the gospel, as in what is the good news? What we talk about when we say the good news of Christ. He's saying Christ's death and resurrection have the power to save. Now, on its surface, that's kind of incoherent. How does that happen? How does somebody else's death save us? It's something we tend to take for granted in today's church, right? It's written about in our liturgy, in our worship, but we don't really take the time to ponder it. We'll be doing that with Paul. So there you go. And you're going to come out experts on all of this, walk around talking about how Romans talks about the saving act of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. We also talk a lot in this book about righteousness, which redefines God's grace. So this is actually the return of an argument that he talked about in Galatians, which we've read in our Bible study before. It's been a few years, but Galatians, which comes later in the Testament, is actually written much early in Paul's career. And in that one, he's working out the tension between the desire of humans to want to do good things to what we would say get into heaven, right? To do good things to impress God, to save ourselves. And he's saying that's not how it works. A righteous person is one who believes in God, who accepts Christ as their savior. And that is what grants you God's grace. That is what automatically gets you into heaven. You don't have to do anything to earn it. It's just by what we call justified by your faith. You see how those two things, if you just take a bird's eye view of it, those are major different themes in Christianity to this day. And I know individually, we all think maybe I should be doing X, Y, and Z to be better. We were raised to some extent that way. And Paul gives a counter argument, which also is Martin Luther's argument, using Paul as his resource, basically. And that goes in the face of the Catholic Church at the time, which said, no, you have to, not only do you have to do good things, you have to pay us if you want to get into heaven. That's in the Middle Ages. But again, throughout this book, Paul is talking about what it means to be a follower of Jesus, using himself as the example. And this is really kind of an early, it's funny, it's not, Christianity isn't even formed, and he's already defending Christianity. And today we call this apologetics, like you're kind of apologizing for Christianity in many ways. And not in the way that we say we're sorry, but it's a more Greekified word. I wish I had a Bible and a dictionary in front of me for apologesis. Was somebody trying to say something at home? I'm sorry. Maybe it's just a throat clearing. Okay, good. We'll keep moving. Almost done, I promise. A few things about Romans that are just kind of just general in the vernacular, for lack of a better word, the church vernacular. This is often thought of as Paul's last will and testament because it is the last written letter that we have. So it's often interpreted as that because it's a summary of everything he thinks. So one way you could interpret it, it's a fair interpretation, is that this is the actual last letter Paul wrote for whatever reason. And he's feeling like, I need to get everything out on paper that I say. And again, when I say that, I mean someone else is writing in the room with him, and Paul is badgering them from across the room. Okay, so but he's getting everything out on paper one last time, or on scroll as it is, a summary of everything he believes in. That's a fair interpretation of this. If it's not the last letter, it's still a important document of a thorough summary of his theology, his belief in God. It's the beginnings of what we call systematic theology, which is theology, again, literally means belief in God or study of God. And systematic theology is kind of what they teach in seminaries, which is a little bit of what we're doing right now, which is basically an orderly account of theology and an examination of all the different strands and possibilities. So some of you have been in things like the Inquirer's class or vestry retreats or whatnot, where I will put you in a different room. Greg, we talked a little bit about this yesterday, but the biggest one I like to use is the Atonement Theology, which, by the way, Paul's going to talk about in here for the first time. What happens on the cross on Good Friday? Not literally Jesus is crucified, but what is symbolically, theologically happening? Why is it happening? That's called Atonement Theology. And a systematic way looks at all the traditions that have it. All of those gentlemen that were on the screen a little while ago all have a different interpretation of what's happening on the cross. One says it is a blood sacrifice, like the lamb going to slaughter. Another says it's a victory over Satan, like Christ, like the painting in the church, in our church, Christ breaking the bonds of hell and rescuing all the dead. Others say it's just an example of self-giving love, and this is Christ showing us this is what you do when you really care about people. You take on the punishment on behalf of them. Do you see how all of those are viable? But you also were kind of hesitant to pick one and stick with it, because it kind of all of them. That's systematic theology, okay? And any given time, hymn writers or other writers, or just those of us sitting in the pew may think, maybe it is a victory over evil and death. Maybe that is what's going on. Or another day you may be like, maybe it's just an example of love, who knows? Who can say for sure is what I mean, not who knows. Now you've got a lot to think about. I'll see you all on Good Friday, right? And I'm wrapping up here. The structure of what we're going to be looking at, and we'll return to this a lot. It just helps to know the letter. So this is not a dear John, how are you? Hawaii's fantastic. Love to mom and dad. This is a little bit of a piece of work, this letter. He knows this is going to be read publicly. He wants it to be read in the temple for everyone to hear, or at house churches. And so it's got a body to it. There is an address and a greeting. That's how we know.
Could you say that again?
Siri wants me to repeat it. I'm sorry. We know it's a letter because it begins with a greeting, dear so-and-so, basically, a version of that. A little bit more. Ooh, that fits somebody's cell phone.
Sounds like a semi.
That was mine, sorry.
No problem. Paul's addresses and greetings are much more flowery, which we'll see. Then the first half, more than half of the letter, is Paul's listing out his doctrine. So that's kind of where we get into the theology part. Then there is what they call hortatory, or what Raymond Brown calls a hortatory, which is basically preaching, sermonizing, and telling them some correctives or things they should be mindful of. And then it ends with a few little mini conclusions, a little bit like, what's the last Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, which ends 16 times, it feels like, it keeps fading out and it comes back and there's another ending. Kind of the same way, he talks about where he's going to go next, which is kind of cool as a historic document. He gives them a blessing. Another example that we know it's a letter for sure is that he speaks specifically to people that are receiving the letter, in this case, a woman named Phoebe. And then concludes it with a doxology, which is a term we're a little familiar with in the church.
Get off.
Sometimes sing something in church called a doxology, which is praise God from whom all blessings flow, right? That's what a doxology is, a little song or prayer to God, a little acknowledgement of the things about God that we love, right? Usually in a Trinitarian formula. All right, and let me just wrap up my part here. We'll actually read the Bible, which I think I say every time we introduce a book. This is another one of my professors who wrote a little more dense book. It looks short, but it's dense. The Story of the Romans, or Story of Romans, the letter. And she says, Romans is Paul's sustained argument for the righteousness of God. And the best way to untangle Paul's complex argument is to understand it as built on a great story, the story of what God has done in Christ. That includes many other stories. So it can ease what Kathy's getting to that point of, this can be an overwhelming letter. It's kind of rich theology, which means it can be kind of dense, and we'll go really slow to make sure we're understanding what Paul's trying to talk about. But she wants to invite you to think of it as a story, as like he's storytelling. He's explaining the story of his faith. He's explaining it with little stories within, and that might be a way into the conversation that Paul's having with us. Okay. All right, so now we're going to start with chapter 1. We'll hear the quote that Paul, this is again what I was talking about, apologetics. Paul is saying, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. I'm not ashamed of the good news. And implying that there's already this idea that people are hiding and in secrecy about their faith, about believing Jesus of Nazareth was the Son of God. Paul talks about his call, typically of being an apostle and not a disciple. So in other words, a disciple may also be an apostle, but an apostle may not always be a disciple. Try to impress your friends with that at dinner parties. He's an apostle because he was not one of Jesus's inner circle, which, as we know from Acts and other tradition, causes some tension with the actual disciples, and understandably. And it's a story in this first chapter. This is again what Kathy Grieve was saying about little stories. There's a story of how Roman house churches came to their present situation. In other words, they were worshiping Jesus as Lord and having Eucharist, breaking bread and having wine and baptizing, but in secrecy. So in the basements or something of homes where they could not be seen or caught by Jewish leaders, Roman guards, etc. Because remember, Rome is pagan. So it wouldn't be Jewish leaders in Rome. I'm sorry. He's writing to Roman house churches because these are the early Christian kind of little missionaries and all. Okay. But again, before he got there, which is interesting. All right, I'm going to stop my share and view your lovely faces. Oops, we can't see you on screen. Hang on one second. All right. Any questions on all that background or backstory, everybody? We did record it, so we'll put it on our YouTube channel if you need to revisit it. That'll post later this afternoon. I'll try to edit out the prayers at the beginning, which I'll try to be mindful to do. Okay, I'm on John, so I'm way off. Here we go. Would anyone, I've done a lot of talking, would anyone like to begin reading Romans? We're going to go a little slow, so 1 to 14. Maybe that's not that slow.
I can try that.
I think I heard Leslie first. Would you go ahead, Leslie?
Fine.
1 to 1 to 14, and what translation are you reading?
I'm reading from the NRSV.
NRSV. Great.
Okay. Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures, the gospel concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh, and was declared to be Son of God with power according to the Spirit of holiness, by resurrection from the dead. Jesus Christ our Lord, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles for the sake of his name, including yourself, who are called to belong to Christ Jesus Christ. To all God's beloved in Rome, who are called to be saints, grace to you and grace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is proclaimed throughout the world. For God, whom I serve with my spirit by announcing the gospel of his Son, is my witness that without ceasing I remember you always in my prayers, asking that by God's will I may somehow at last succeed in coming to you. For I'm longing to see you so that I may share with you some spiritual gift to strengthen you, or rather so that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that I have often intended to come to you, but thus far have been prevented, in order that I may reap some harvest among you as I have among the rest of the Gentiles. I am a debtor both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and the foolish. Hence my eagerness to proclaim the gospel to you also who are in Rome.
Fabulous. Let's stop there. Okay, I have a different translation. I don't know about anybody else, so there were some remarkable differences in there, but obviously the same concept. So what did you all notice? What stuck out to you? Yeah, Greg.
The first thing that jumped out to me is one of those things which is really not settled yet in this day and age. And that was where it says, the gospel concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh, but was made Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead. In other words, this almost implies to me that Jesus was not born the Son of God.
Yeah.
He became the Son of God at his resurrection.
Interesting. Yeah. I think, I mean, you're right. It's a little muddled, right? Isn't
is
it?
a little
Yeah,
muddled.
you could interpret it that way. Absolutely. I think maybe what Paul might be attempting to do, but not quite as successful, is to almost to say that, you know, obviously he was born Son of God, but he didn't lean into the Son of God or take on the mantle of being Son of God until the resurrection happened, which also is still kind of controversial, because it's like, well, what is all the 3 years of teaching all about, you know, in the baptism and everything?
Well, also, and if you just substitute one word and say was recognized as,
Right.
was recognized due to his resurrection.
Yeah, exactly.
Then that might have been when people first actually acknowledged him being the Son of God.
Right. It's fascinating. Good stuff.
Greg, the word for that declared is the Greek word horizo, and it refers to set to mark our boundaries or limits. So I'm not sure Paul is trying to say that this is what defined him, but what demonstrated that it was the marking out, the delimitation, the limitation that determined or that appointed, that enabled us to clearly understand.
Okay. So kind of help reveal almost kind of what we're saying. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Yes.
I looking at the notes in the annotated Oxford Study Bible, God declared the good news in advance. The good news concerns God's Son kings of Israel, Israel itself, Roman emperors, and significant philosophers were designated sons of God. Jesus Christ is God's son physically, according to the flesh, descended from David. So I thought that was kind of interesting, that the difference between God's son or sons of God.
Right, exactly. He's kind of parsing out the difference there of what we're, not a fleshly son like we think of, but a more spiritual son. But also claiming that Jesus is a physical descendant of David is not without its controversy as well. And so we find later in the later Gospels, by the way, Mark, Matthew, and Luke take pains to spell that out as well. We don't know the historicity of that. It's a little shaky. Because actually the descendant is Joseph, and Joseph's not his biological father, right? So it's a little, but it kind of gives you a glimpse into, in antiquity, how they thought of parentage a little bit, that adoption had a little bit more, felt like it was part of the bloodline. Yeah,
So Mary was not a descendant of David?
Mary was not a descendant of David. Nope.
Well, it's tying Jesus firmly into the messianic expectations. Paul's making clear here as the son of David that the Messiah who was to come was supposed to be a descendant of David. So he's tying this, with this statement, he's tying Jesus as the expected Messiah to that the Hebrew people, the Jews, were expecting.
Exactly. And verse 2 to 3, at least, my translation, which is CEB, God promised this good news about his son. I don't have a Greek in front of me, but that would probably be the word evangelon or something, which is where we get evangelical from, or evangelism. But that's the word for gospel.
Yeah.
Yes,
right? It's a form of that. It's a form of that, Greg. It's propageliomai. Yeah, so it is a form of engelion. Yeah, engelion. Yeah.
Kind of the origins, I'd have to check to see if Paul's written about it in earlier letters, but this is kind of the origins here of cementing why we call those books gospels. Those gospel writers would have been aware of Paul and would have said, okay, Paul talks about God's promise of good news about his son. So now you get, what's the next book chronologically would be Mark's gospel. By the way, 14 years later. And then the very first sentence is the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So you see how they've created, with Paul's help, the gospel writers create a new genre, which is not biography. It looks like biography, but it's more of a spiritual biography in many ways. Yeah, and that's good news. Kind of a little bit of the origins of why we call it Good Friday as well. It's kind of an interesting take on the word good. Let me just read some. This is in the CEB Bible, a little background here again, because again, it's really unusual that he's writing to them, but he has not been there. So who is there? What's going on? Paul's letter was likely prompted by tensions between groups of largely Gentile and largely Jewish believers in Rome. So there are Jewish believers in Rome, perhaps in different house churches. Some Gentile believers seem to have developed a sense of superiority towards Jews. It's possible this situation arose after the Emperor Claudius, at the time, expelled members of the Jewish community from Rome in 49 CE, Common Era, by the way, if you haven't heard that. If so, it's also possible that new tensions arose when Jews returned to the city and thus also to the churches in 54. Since so few Jews had believed the gospel, some Gentile believers may have felt that God had given up on the chosen people, in other words, Israel. At the same time, many Jewish believers may have wondered if God was fair and just. Had God in fact rejected them? So kind of for Jews, it's a kind of a return of an old wound of, is God abandoning us again? We thought we were the chosen people, the Exodus. But what's interesting is this is happening in Rome, in a mostly pagan town in Italy, with an emperor, an oppressive regime that is expelling Jews based on race and religion. And then on top of that, you have Gentiles, so anyone who's not Jewish, basically asserting themselves as saying, well, you know, Paul, I mean, it's possible Paul's written to Rome beforehand. Paul is saying, you know, we're just as good as you all in Christianity. And then you start to get this kind of culture war a little bit going on here within. It's really interesting.
Yeah, some people believe that that's really what's behind this whole letter, is the conflict between the Gentiles and the Jews here, and how the church is suffering this controversy. And Paul's trying to address that, and what he does here next kind of establishes, you know, how neither the Jews nor the Gentiles from their origins got, you know, the gospel completely correctly. So he's addressing this head on, and the whole argument he develops out of this is his basis of what creates the Christian community. Yeah.
Or if we would say it, you know, you kind of see two groups kind of tussling in the playground, and then here comes Paul in the middle going like, you both have it wrong. I'll tell you the truth. Let me start with when I was but a child. Right. Yeah, exactly. Any other things people noticed, or, you know, either phrases or words that stuck out to you?
I did. I just, since I've come to this church, I've seen the emphasis on being together as a community. It's kind of a base for other revelations, and it feels that way. And in verse 12, what I mean is that we can mutually encourage each other while I'm with you. We can be encouraged by the faithfulness we find in each other, both your faithfulness and mine. And he may be just talking about himself and the group as a whole, but it struck me that, excuse me, I'm seeing this kind of thing right here in Grace Church.
Yeah. That's beautiful.
Giving each other strength.
Yes.
Exactly. It's a common theme for in my time at this church too, that again, I was just talking about this recently, that, you know, don't underestimate that this is a mixed, let's not even say theologically, but a mixed political church, you know, and always has been. And that to have all of us put those differences aside, or the things we disagree on, whether it's anything from vaccinations or masks to, you know, who we voted for, or about guns, to put all those things aside and to sit next to each other in the pew and give each other a hug and, you know, make coffee hour for each other. I mean, that's really what the church, the capital C church, does at its best. It really is, because these things are more important.
I have to point.
Yes, go ahead,
I was
Dawn.
going to say, being in the South, when the racism everybody talks about, I don't see it. You know, I talk to a black lady as much as a white lady. The color of her skin doesn't matter. It's, you know, we're a community. We're all in this together. And it's just, when I see the news and all the racism, and where's the racism? I was just talking to this lady and we didn't hate each other.
Right. It's true. It's, you know, and I think we're kind of, and sorry to use the phrase, we're kind of through the looking glass, where what I think where we're at, and it's much more nuanced than we used to think of it. I think, you know, we got to a place in the last 50 years where the word racism, or calling someone racist, is such a derogatory term. It's like calling somebody, you know, like a murderer. You know, it's on that. And the origin really of what we're trying to do with the word is to say we want people that are not persons of color to realize they have an advantage through no fault of anyone's own, just by birthright. And, you know, we've long worked on that in this church. It's constantly working on it, constantly going through it, to not say, we're not blaming you for being white per se. We're just saying that there is we would acknowledge that there is in systemic racism, which means that, you know, you have an advantage whether you realize it or not, and that others have a disadvantage. But when somebody takes that or interprets that as being called racist, the conversation ends, shuts down, and becomes, now people think I'm evil or hate, and it's like, no, not one bit at all. And actually, we're trying to find a way to work together. Yeah,
But I think both things exist side by side.
they do.
I mean, there is still evident personal racism,
Right.
which you can see, but then the structural or systemic racism in things like obtaining mortgage loans, employment, all that kind of thing. I mean, there are all kinds of factual statistics that show that we have a deeply embedded systemic racism
Exactly.
in this country.
And that we have a responsibility to correct it.
To correct it.
It's going to take a while, but
Right.
it has to begin.
And that can certainly start on the personal level,
Right.
you know, but it needs to go deeper than that.
Exactly.
And I think that it's hard to overcome it, because even I try to think of myself as being, I know nobody is totally not racist, but I went to a Catholic mass in Kansas City with a girlfriend of mine who was married to a black man, and the whole parish was black, except for me and her. And I felt uncomfortable, and I felt like, why? They believe the same thing I do. They were very welcoming to me, but I was the only white woman in this church.
Yeah,
And I thought, this is stupid, but it's there.
but it's there because it's just there. I mean,
That's
that's
just
the
a
world
little
we're in.
taste, that's just a little taste of what Black people
Yes.
feel
Right.
all the
I
time.
know.
Yeah,
for sure.
and this isn't the best illusion, but it's kind of like an episode of Twilight Zone, but a little bit like when the roles are reversed. Now see how it feels. Yeah,
Right.
it's interesting. Well, anyway, what's great, thank you, Dawn, for bringing that up, because that is clearly in the background here, and clearly another example of how Scripture is a living word. This is not a dead document. This is the reason this is committed down into a book like this is because it is thematically relevant to this day. It is still coming up. And we're seeing it in, to some degree, to a great degree, with the Ukrainian, Russian, there's multiple,
Situation.
the whole situation, multiple things going on there. But we might have to leave that for right now. Sorry, before we move on, let me, Greg, you were, oh no, it wasn't Greg. It was Leslie. Can you read verse 14 again? The translation I have is very different. I wanted to hear that vocabulary again.
Okay, I am a debtor both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish.
Barbarians.
Yeah.
Doesn't that sound nasty?
I have both open right next to each other, and I saw that too, and I thought, it says I have responsibility both to Greeks and those who don't speak Greek,
Yeah,
both to the wise.
Oh,
I
yeah.
have my commentary open, and it's saying barbarians should just be read as foreigners. And so the Latins in Rome would be foreigners to the Greeks.
Yeah,
So not necessarily not as bad as the word is now.
exactly. So I think this is exactly why we read different translations at the same time, because the NRSV, which is the Episcopal Church's default translation that Leslie's reading, is itself 40 years old. And barbarian is not a word we use really kindly, right? Even though they probably thought they meant well, right?
Greg, the Greek word is barbaros. The Greek word is barbaros. And the reason he uses it, the reason Paul uses it is because the Greeks considered anyone that didn't speak Greek to be barbarian. It actually was kind of a denigrating term. It refers to, they would talk to people who spoke other languages as if they were going blah, 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 because they couldn't understand it. So they called them barbarians. So that's some of the context behind there, because he's dealing with Greeks and a whole cosmopolitan group there in Rome.
Isn't Paul Greek? I mean,
Yeah.
Tarsus is in Greece, right?
Yeah.
So that was probably.
Well, he's Greek speaking. Yeah, it's kind of a mesh land, but he was a Pharisee, so he was Jewish.
Other countries
And a Roman
consider
citizen.
themselves.
And a Roman citizen, yeah, he was it all.
This,
He's a barbarian.
even though Rome was in charge, this was very much a Hellenistic culture. The Romans took the Greek culture, much of it, and applied it to their governmental system. So in very many ways, this is very much still a Greek world. And the language that most educated people used was Greek. The Romans also spoke Romans, and Paul, of course, probably spoke Hebrew. And a lot of the disciples spoke. Let's see, that would be not Hebrew, but Aramaic. Yeah, they spoke Aramaic, but the language, it's kind of like in the world now that the language that most people speak commonly is English, and Greek was kind of that same way at that point.
Exactly right. Fascinating. I hope it's not the origin of the name Barbara. Right. I think it's actually probably Barbaros, probably is more like Babel, from Tower of Babel, which means confusion, confusion of languages and all. Well, anyway, we'll have to look about. Barb is going to go buy baby name books to figure out what the hell her parents were thinking. Right.
A lot of the women's names are derivations of men's names, so Barbara is probably a derivation of something totally different, Robert or something,
Yeah, exactly.
Barbara.
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 I'm curious, does everybody have as the last sentence of phrase in this reading, he has come to those who speak Greek and don't speak Greek, both to the wise and to the foolish. I'm wondering if every translation you have about foolish, is there another translation that uses a different word?
Not mine.
No,
Mine says I am obliged both to Greeks and non-Greeks, both to the wise and to the foolish.
Okay, great.
This one refers to the intelligent and the unintelligent.
Oh, okay.
And those two sets of words mean something very different.
Yeah.
And this one
Yeah.
says the wise and the ignorant,
Right.
so
So, yeah.
uneducated. I would
That-
become-
Right.
The Greek word is anoetos. It means unintelligent, stupid. That's what it comes from.
So that's all non-Greeks.
That's kind of consistent.
Yeah.
Yeah, basically.
All non-Greeks are
Well,
stupid.
and consistent with the original meaning of that barbarian thing, which is just, but remember too, that's Paul's acknowledging in some ways, I mean, he's revealing that he is inherently racist as well, right? So he's owning up to it. But he's also he's acknowledging that I have a responsibility to those as well. We can't just forget them because they don't understand, right?
The barbarous part refers just to language. That's not a cultural distinction. The anoetos is referring to people who are intelligent, people who aren't, people who are educated, people who are not. It's not he wants to make clear it's not based on knowledge right here. It's not a knowledge base. It's on a different perspective, a different foundation.
He's just haven't been exposed to the ideas of Christ.
There you go. Could be. Albeit, he would change his word choice if he was here today, for sure, I'm sure. Okay, let me just read from the Common English Bible, these final verses, at least that are on my page, because it kind of completes a thought, and then we'll probably have to call it for the day. This is just the last couple of verses here. That's why I'm ready to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is God's own power for salvation to all who have faith in God, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. God's righteousness is being revealed in the gospel from faithfulness for faith. As it is written, the righteous person will live by faith. And real quick, my notes say he's quoting the book of Habakkuk, for the prophet. Yeah. So there he's getting, now he's moved into the theme. So already you see the dynamics of how he does his letters again. the first 7 verses are all introduction and flowery language, not just about his feelings about the good news of Jesus Christ, but to those in Rome who were dearly loved by God, to the beloved in Rome, called to be God's people, grace to you and peace from God our Father and Lord Jesus Christ. Again, Episcopalians or those who are adopting Episcopalian faith, doesn't that sound a little bit like our worship services? You see how much Paul's influence became part of this, that scripture became part of how we do our services, which is to begin with a greeting. Blessed be God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's different in Lent. The peace of the Lord be always with you. I mean, this is all from Paul's letters and stuff. It's really great. And same with morning prayer if you do the online service. And again, he does, so now you see his writing style, which I admit I cop to a lot, which is you know, it's almost like he would probably be a good joke teller because everything kind of happens in triples. So the rule of thirds, and they're this or this, this or this. And then for one more measure, Jew and Greek. So what have we done before? We've done barbarians and not barbarians. We've done the wise and the foolish. And now he goes, and I'm here to remind you of God's own power for salvation to all that faith in God, to the Jew and also to the Greek as well. And that's an oratory style. That's knowing that this letter gets read publicly, that would keep people entertained, hopefully. David.
One thing, go ahead.
No, sir, go ahead.
I was just gonna say one thing I think we need to keep track of here is the word righteousness.
Yes.
And all throughout, Paul's going to use this, but I think it's important for us to understand what righteousness means in this, well, as it's used. The Greek word for righteousness is dikaiosune.
Oh,
and
yeah.
what he's referring to here is not righteousness like some people would believe, moral behavior. Righteousness refers to ethics. It refers to justice. So when you read righteousness, you're not talking about just not doing the wrong things and doing the right things, but it actually refers to righteousness of God being the ethics of God, the justice of God. So I think we probably, as we read that throughout, it's important to keep that distinction in mind.
I'm so glad you said it. I put a note for myself for homework for next week because I want to do a little word study on that word. It's a bit like hesed in Hebrew. In fact, they're actually intentionally, I think, really similar. So we may remember from our study of the Old Testament, hesed, H-E-S-E-D in English. It's although that's kind of an insult to Hebrew, but hesed talks about righteousness, God's faithfulness. It's meant multiple meanings and all. And you're right, what David's saying, that word is a derivative of diakonos, which is where we get the diaconate or deacons in the church, which is a service-based ministry, a social justice-based ministry too. So food for thought, right? Oh my gosh, you all have so